Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for sticking with me throughout your lunch break. This second glass is not gin and tonic. Very nice to be with you today. You can see what I'm going to talk about. My name is McElvoy. I am executive editor at The Economist, and I also present its podcast show called The Economist Asks. We're going to look at the world in view, so perhaps stepping back a bit from lots of the other themes. I see you've got a fantastic agenda here at the conference. I'm going to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour, and I have just under half an hour now to do it, so I'd better get going, of what we think the stresses, transformations and opportunities are in the world today. And I'll try to put it in the context of a bit of backdrop, which I hope is useful to you, but I would like to leave 5 minutes at the end in which you put me under pressure a bit and ask me anything that you'd like to ask me. So just a word about myself. I started out as a journalist in back end of 1988, 1989, which, as anyone old enough in the room will remember, was a pretty good time to be starting out as a journalist with a focus on global current affairs. I was then subsequently a correspondent in East Germany, where I personally brought down the Berlin Wall. Yugoslavia, where I didn't personally start the war, but I did cover it and saw what happens and how quickly stable entities in geopolitics can break apart with terrible violence and bloodshed. And in Russia, and well, you know what I managed to achieve there. One of the things that I'm reflecting about at the moment and was writing in a column this week was that when I started work, there was a particular day in 1989 in June when Tiananmen Square happened. You'll remember that remarkably brave eruption of protest against the Chinese authority, then subsequently 50 days of protest mown down by the Chinese military, but leaving, I think, that sense of an unfinished revolution. Once again, if we look at our television screens this week, we see something similar happening, not on the scale of Tiananmen, and an even more repressive China, I think, under Mr. Xi in his third term in the leadership. But we see again how things that you maybe think are settled, China, zero COVID strategy, repressive way of going about it, etc., but that's somehow there, and also in the northwest of the country, where the Uyghur minority is so dreadfully affected, that these pressures build up again. East Germany, you could say, well, there's finished business for you. Germany was, of course, unified and is a stable entity. But exactly that desire that East Germans showed, I lived in East Germany for many years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the desire to break out of a system that you had no say in creating, no real say in creating or sustaining, in this case, Soviet communism, then led to the eruption, and we see exactly the same pattern, albeit on a larger scale, with Ukraine. The desire simply to control your own destiny and not have it dictated by a power bloc in which you have little ability to influence events. The third story, and I think it was about the 9th of June in 1989, was Iran and the death of Ayatollah Khomeini and the subsequent hopes for a more liberal Iran. Well, once again, here we are, 30 few years on, and we see, again, people on the streets of Iran effectively demonstrating for the same things. So you could say we haven't made much progress, but I think in a sense we have. I think we've had a very testing 30 years. I think the hopes of liberal democracy have, in many cases, come under more pressure, perhaps in the last decade, and particularly because it has also taken hold, as you know, in the West, as much as a challenge to precepts of liberal democracy and rules-based orders. Perhaps when I was starting out, it was, well, that's over there, that's somebody else's problem, and I'll go and cover it. I think we've all felt some of the strains to varying degrees, without putting everyone in the same basket. If you were in America when Donald Trump was president, and often with populist, nationalist movements of different types expressing different frustrations in Europe. So where is this likely to lead us? I'm going to start with Ukraine, because I think so much flows from Ukraine, and I want to give you 3 possible ways in which I think the war could work out. The first one, which is actually the subject of the last show I made, just in case anyone likes podcasts for the flight on the way home, is an interview that I did with General Ben Hodges, who's a very combat experienced, recently retired US generals, because I like the ones who've got their hands dirty recently rather than 20, 30 years ago. And he is a huge optimist about Ukraine and the war. He's also a very good military strategist. He thinks the war is going better for Ukraine than many other Western analysts think, and I thought I would just sort of summarize why that might be and a couple of possible challenges to it. The real advantage that Ukraine has is that it has a very motivated fighting force. In a lot of the wars that I've covered in the past, either everybody was sort of equally motivated. That would certainly be true for the Balkans. Everybody thought they were kind of right. And that was also why it was such a dreadful, in effect, a civil war, really, across the former Yugoslavia. That's not really the case with Russia and Ukraine, because if you look at where Ukraine is now, it is getting better and better supplied by the heavy artillery, the heavy weaponry it needs. We've seen that trend of Russian defeats. And whatever one thinks, I've met Mr. Putin on one occasion, and so therefore I doubt he remembers me very well, but I remember it, is that he has everything on his side except a kind of unified military to carry out his objectives. There's at the last count, 4 or 5 generals who are currently looking after strategy on Ukraine, depending on who's in favor or who's not with Mr. Putin that week. And I think we've seen some of the results of that and of an underprepared, undermotivated fighting force in Russia. Not that they are in any sense sympathetic to Ukraine, but having been told that this war would end quickly, the Kremlin does have a problem, which is why I watch a lot of Russian propaganda television, so you don't have to, is relentlessly telling us that this is still going Russia's way. But there is a difficulty when you said it would be over within a couple of weeks. It was a walkover. They were a bunch of strange Ukrainian neo-Nazis, job done. I think as we head towards the end of the year, and we'll soon be a year into this war, that no longer washes. And that, of course, the logistics, the battlefield logistics that Ukraine has are very, very linked in to the Western military system for all the problems, the genuine ones it has with supply. The battlefield visibility, while not dictated by US, NATO, British and other generals, there is a fantastic depth of military expertise behind plucky Ukraine. If you listen to the story from Kiev, of course, it's all plucky Ukraine, but you'd expect that because they're the ones fighting the war. But there is more behind it. Let's look at the second scenario, which is stalemate. Ukraine's troops doing very well at the moment. Russians have retreated from Kherson, which, as you might remember from news coverage, was strategically very important. But every kilometre now, I think, that Ukraine tries to take is going to be very difficult to do so. And Vladimir Putin, who is very good at exploiting Western weaknesses, that really, as a former KGB officer, what he's trained to do, and he does it very, very well, is that he tries to slow the Ukrainian advance. Europe has the difficult winter that we know we're all going into. I imagine we're reasonably well protected in this audience from the more severe effects of the energy and cost of living crisis. But if we feel it, then certainly those down the income scale are feeling it more, and the pressures on governments rise to look after, if you like, their own backyard. So there is an option that Europe is struggling to fulfill its energy requirements, that Vladimir Putin is able to hold out both himself in power, but crucially also with the so-called special operation, Spetsops, in Ukraine, otherwise known as waging war. He has something else in his sights, which I think we'll come on to in just a moment, which is he hopes that Donald Trump returns to the White House, and that is not at all out of the question. It's a very high-stakes gamble because the other side of that is Russian public opinion, which is very hard to gauge because propaganda is a thick blanket over what Russians get to consume. They're not consuming what you and I are consuming about this war. But nonetheless, that the message bleeds through, unfortunate metaphor, but probably true, that this is costing too much in lives and that it is not going to be concluded. And Mr. Putin then looks very vulnerable to an internal coup, and that is basically, if you look at Russian history for the last century, when people ask me how this ends, well, if history's any guide, and it isn't always, but it can be, that's how it ends, because that's what they usually do. And of course, there is the third and perhaps more unwelcome scenario, well, certainly more unwelcome, is that yes, Ukraine is making progress, that the leadership is under pressure, and that the worst case analysis is the deployment of a nuclear weapon. I am, if you like, slightly more on the cautious side about the likelihood of that, because I think if Mr. Putin does so, it was not to talk down at all the dreadful impact of using any nuclear weapon and breaking that sort of omerta. But if he does, I think it'll be on the battlefield. It will not be, what one sort of imagines from Dr. Strangelove. So he'll simply be doing the same sort of damage using a nuclear tactic that he's sort of doing already. And I think at that point, I think that's a very dangerous point, were it to happen, and heaven forbid, because also the problems with containing the aftermath and the fallout are as great or graver than the damage. But I think that is very risky for Mr. Putin, because I think China is perhaps the red line in the background with his relationship and backing from Beijing. Other allies might start to peel off because there is a great concern, I think, about what the aftermath is. And as much as autocrats don't care too much, the thought of ending up in an endless stream of cases in the International Criminal Court may give them pause for thought in backing that option. Also, I'm not convinced that the Russian military will back it either, and that the back channels that still exist, despite the breakdown of communication, are between Russian military, US military, and the West. We don't know that they will say no, but they have more of a say in it. And also, I think it would get a reprisal from the US, which would be conventional, but very heavy. And frankly, I think if it happened, I think the person who definitely wouldn't survive it in power would be our friend, Bad Vlad. Let's widen out a bit to look at what the implications of all this might be. Well, the second and perhaps most important, if you're looking at your business and how that's going to go, and also your own prosperity, is recession, and how deep and how long our recessions are going to be. There is no doubt major economies will tumble into recession as we go into 2023, even if they're able to claim that the last quarter was great. It's a bit like saying your last sales results were great. Please don't look at the ones before or after, but like December was great, right? So I think we will see that. We will see a relatively shallow recession in the US. You can already begin to see where that might come out in 2023. The strength of the dollar is absolutely paramount there. Conversely, if you're on the other end of that, it's very difficult. And I think where we're sitting in continental Europe, I think it's going to be quite a deep recession. I think the UK is also in for a very long recession indeed. And climbing back out of it, given the global backdrop, is going to be difficult. So the strong dollar will hit food prices, it will hit other consumer goods, and that is a big challenge for trade more generally. I did promise the organisers that I would move to being optimistic, but you might have to give me 10 more minutes of just being a bit of an Eeyore here. I think we have to be realistic that we have a recessionary backdrop and that all of our plans need to work around that. Of course, it does mean that if you're offering great value, here, I did find something good to say. If you're offering great value to your audiences, to your clients, if you're going up the value scale, but you're not absolutely making out like bandits in terms of margins, I think that is a really, really good place for businesses to be in. And I say that to our own events business as well, that there is something about it. I might do less travel, I might go to fewer things, I need value, I need a perception that I'm not, in a sense, going out to just to sort of do something. It's nice to do, it's necessary to do. That seems to be always an upside of recession. It's also why a lot of companies, startups, etc., get founded in recessions, because they see the opportunity to disrupt and to take perhaps the fat off more traditional businesses. And we will see dollar-led investment flowing into businesses. So if you're able to get hold of some of that, please let me know how. But no, a dollar-led investment is very important, certainly in creative businesses. I've seen a lot of that. I'm seeing a lot of independent companies coming into my sector, sort of culture broadcasting from the US, setting up in London. People like moving themselves wholesale to set up businesses, because being in the UK or being in the Eurozone with a strong dollar, it goes a lot further. So maybe could you think about where, if you at all, you could access that? And currency triage is, of course, so important to the events sector like this. I have a feeling there might be more expertise in the room at actually doing it than I have. But deciding where to hold your event, obviously looking at the rate of the currencies and the likely long-term trend of the currency where you're planning to do something next year is certainly worth it, and that will be one area which you can maybe offset some of the additional costs of that horrible galloping 10% inflation, which I think is with us for a while, and I think central banks are cautious, saying when it will end. I would sort of bank on it being with us at least till September of next year or thereabouts. Okay, silver linings. Countries obviously do need to secure their energy supplies, given what we're living through. In the short term, they will go back to fossil fuels, but in the medium term, they are going to accelerate the switch to renewables, to solar power, and to alternatives. Hydrocarbons controlled by autocrats has not turned out to be a winning recipe. I'll see Germany, and not only Germany. So wind, solar, nuclear, hydrogen will all benefit. That means, there's quite a lot packed in there. If you think about it, there's fantastic content there to explore. What does that mean? What does the hydrogen revolution mean? Are we green? Are we blue? Oceans technology is another sector I've been working on a lot, where I think we absolutely underestimate what that can mean, but also how that can change a place. I went to speak on this in Halifax, Nova Scotia, recently, and looked at Halifax, Nova Scotia on the map. Didn't realise really till I got there what was going on, how it has completely changed a place that was sort of out on a limb in the Atlantic, slightly sleepy fishing and shipbuilding place, into a booming centre for alternative energy sources. And of course that attracts conventions. There were 3 in town the week I was there, and it makes it particularly important, I think, that we keep an eye on the global map and look where innovation is happening and will happen, because the energy crisis we're in at the moment is not the way the energy market is going to be in the next few years. Down to the sort of nitty-gritty. Well, divided America, nothing new, so I won't preach to you about that. I would say, how do we read the midterms? A question I'm most asked when I speak in America. I would say Republicans did worse than expected, and I think that is a great credit to the Democrats, who's stuck to a fairly forthright message of taking on Make America Great Again and everything that it stands for, which is not making America great again, it's setting America back again. That was a very difficult risk to take. The Biden administration took it. I think it is, on the other side, not entirely decided at all that Democrats profit from this when they go to the main election in 2024. Those social, cultural, economic divides still loom very large. And if Donald Trump does indeed persist with this entry into the 2024 presidential race, yes, it will pour fuel on that fire, and it will materially affect everything that I've talked about before. The relationship with Russia, where I think there is great fear, not that Trump is particularly pro-Russian, Donald Trump is pro-Donald Trump, but we do know that he's an unreliable partner for the so-called rules-based order, which has come back together again to support Ukraine. So that is absolutely one to watch. I personally don't think Joe Biden is in good enough health to go into the next race. That's the problem. The Democrats had decent midterms, but they can't go with the old guy who's there. And that's tricky, because they can't, at the moment, agree on who the successor might be. So I think we have to look to Joe Biden effectively going quite a long way towards the next election, and that they then do a switch at the convention before. That said, I was at the convention where everyone thought was, John Kerry was on the path to be president, and a speech was given in a sort of side event by a guy called Barack Obama. And suddenly all the light in the world basically changed towards Barack Obama. Of course, he wasn't ready to get into that race, but he sure got into the next one, and as you know, became President Barack Obama. So it is possible for candidates to emerge late in the process, and that's what I think will happen, a centrist Democrat candidate. Flashpoints. Well, more than enough of those. All right. China, yeah, you knew I was going to mention that. I think with Russia distracted, events in China are probably those that are not getting enough attention, perhaps back on our agenda this week because of the protests. There is a weakness to the Chinese position, which is, as you can see by the protest, is this draconian zero COVID policy and the fact that it's been sustained for too long without a satisfactory vaccine rollout for everything that has been got wrong in many parts of the West about COVID. Whether we're here in Spain or in the UK, we've got that bit right. An interesting detail my colleague who covers China in detail told me was that television was having to cut out images of the crowds watching the World Cup. The World Cup is very popular in China, but once you can see people going to sporting events, you're kind of wondering why you're locked down in your flat in Chengdu or not able to meet your working colleagues. And that has so an awful lot of extra work by the hardworking Chinese censor has gone into just basically chopping bits out of the World Cup to make it look like nobody went. But I think that does tell you something about the underlying weakness of the system, and also that, frankly, the Chinese economy is not in the state that it was. If you remember, a few years ago, it was very popular to say China would overtake America. That isn't going to happen, and it may now never happen. India's economy is now rising so fast that India and China is maybe the next economic front to watch, because that is not going to happen in a partnership of buddies, and they have not worked well on their relationship. And as we know, when trade relationships fray, as they've done with China and the US, they fray very fast indeed. There is, of course, a risk to Taiwan in the scenario I describe if President Xi decides he needs to be more muscular to prove his control and, if you like, to bring back Taiwan, as he would see it, to the Chinese family in the way he's brought back Hong Kong, which is not pleasant to watch if you're seeing demonstrators being rounded up, as I have done on the streets of Hong Kong in the last years, and kicked out of their jobs. Middle East, I would say, shifting alliances there are going to dominate the year ahead. It's so interesting to see so many stands here from states in the Middle East. I was just wondering, are they all going to get together here at this conference? Because there is something in the air with the so-called Abraham Accords, where Saudi Arabia very likely to sign up to those, formalizing relations with Israel, putting more pressure on Iran, which looks like the country that is most isolated in this mix, but where also, I referred to it at the top, the internal response is to get tougher, get internally a lot tougher. But settling commercial relations with Saudi and UAE would be massively significant for Middle East business. It would make life a lot easier if you're working with UAE, and I would guess, do people in the room work in the region? Anyone work with the Middle East regularly? Yes. So I think that will be significant. And even if you don't, she said, quickly acknowledging the fact that a lot of you don't, it tends to impact on businesses because it's such a rich area, for businesses and conferences to meet. So I think Middle East business could look up next year. On the last couple of things I just want to sort of turn to, I would say, Latin America, string of election victories at the moment for the left, the very welcome defeat of Bolsonaro in Brazil. I predict 2023, life being as it is, will go the other way, because there is continuing unpopularity of incumbents and very, very difficult economic circumstances there, both in Brazil, and the other country I would point to as decisive for the region is Chile. Again, a place, it was really coming out of its shell in the international community. Its education system was the best in the region. It was also a place that was reaching out to host events. I think that's gone the other way. There was a kind of, in effect, a popular revolution against that in bringing Gabriel Boric to power there for the hard left. 6 months into the administration, predictably, the economy is no better and probably worse. His constitutional reforms have been scrapped in a popular referendum. So we have this phenomenon of the unpopular populist. That said, it only goes to show if you can get it all wrong in Brazil by going to the hard right with Bolsonaro, you can get it equally wrong by going to the hard left in Latin America. And this is, I think, the unresolved issue for the region is, can it depart from this vociferous yin and yang politics, which is holding back the economy, and for Chile to be going so far behind with growth predicted to be just over 1.5% in a country that was a booming economy with supply side reforms is a sign of how quickly you can undo good stuff. By the way, I don't mean to say everything. I'm very well aware of the background and the human rights record of Chile. I made it pointing out that when you've come out of that and you make gains as a society, you have to stick to them, particularly in this global backdrop, or you will suffer. Finally, travel and trade, just before we go to questions. Well, our prediction at The Economist is that travel spending will regain its 2019 level pre-pandemic at about $1.4 trillion, which sounds very promising, except a lot of that is down to inflation. But the actual number of tourist trips as well will still be below the pre-pandemic level. People are, I don't know how much this reflects your experience, but people are traveling for longer. They're maybe adding destinations to one trip. That sense of value, also climate awareness, is making businesses much more aware of that. And also the red pencil, I think we probably have experienced some of it ourselves, is going through some business travel. So value, I think, will inhere in the conferences, the events, the gatherings, the travel. That brings the best value, that is best prepared and best resourced. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating to hear that from the Generation Z perspective of the previous speaker. You know, what's the extra value that you can add to how you do things, who you feature, how you bring people together that you maybe didn't do before, and where do you see new technology playing a role in that? We do a little guide to the year ahead at The Economist. We have great fun putting together the words of the next year. So I'm just going to finish with a few of them, and we'll see how right we are. So we think passkey will be your new password. If you figured out what to do with your passkey, you're already ahead of the trend, but it means that you're going to spend a lot less time losing your password. Yay. Your virtual reality will be mixed reality. Augmented reality and the metaverse, notwithstanding the problems of Meta and those vast layoffs that Mark Zuckerberg has had to make because he's invested so hard and so fast. I believe that the metaverse in some form is a happening thing. I don't mean to say that he's going to win this race, but I think brands are not happy with a 2D experience. They know we're moving towards something more akin to 3D, something that brings together the feeling of being more live, but also being able to operate in the real world. That mixed mode, I think, is here to stay. Who wins that race, I don't know, but a lot of money is going to be spent along the way while they try to figure that out. You won't, I think, be investing in classic crypto. You may find yourself still interested in the functionality of blockchain. I wish you a very happy 2023, notwithstanding the global backdrop. It won't be an easy ride, but it will certainly be an intriguing and a fascinating one for all of us in all of our businesses. I've got about 3 minutes if you'd like to ask some questions. Thank you. Thank you. Keep going, so I can drink the gin. And there are mics going around. We're doing this old school, given the time pressure.
Hi.
Yes, hi.
Hi, I'm Tijn from Business Traveler magazine. You mentioned the turmoil, one of the three scenarios in Russia, and one is change from within.
Yeah.
We see protests now in Iran. We see smaller protests in China. Do you foresee this going on and leading to a change in actual leadership?
Great question. Yes, but I think it's a very, very long road. And the countries that you've highlighted there, I would say particularly China and Iran, where Iran theocracy, Russia, not even a communist theocracy anymore. I mean, they've slightly ditched all of that, really, other than to go back to a sort of Russia first nationalism. These are very, very difficult systems to shift in short order. But I do believe, and this may be the optimist in me, that having seen the revolutions of 1989, that was, in a sense, we all got a bit overexcited by that because change happened so quickly. And that was also because you had a benign actor in the late phase of Mikhail Gorbachev who supported those changes. I think you don't have that at the moment. You don't have that on the other side, either in China or in Russia, is the person who's just saying, well, like right now, don't shoot. Or maybe give a little, be flexible. And we need to get back to that, but we have very little influence over it. All I would say is the fact to me that when you saw people go onto the street in Iran, this 33 years after 1989, and you see the same thing in China, that the fact that that still exists in the society, I think tells you that it is not extirpated. It's not the end of the story that China is like it is now. I think in our lifetime, and we're both, as 28, so, in our lifetime, I think we will see big changes. I think Iran, because of the balance of power is harder. in the Shia Sunni world. But at the same time, the one thing that the reason Iran is in ferment, apart from people being rightly upset about their rights and women's rights, is that the economy is in a bad way. They're under sanctions, and eventually that message gets through. Sometimes I think you have to go through a very bad period to get to reform. But I like the sense of your question. Do I think it matters in the long road? Yes. Do I think it always leads you, and where liberal Democrats like myself being too optimistic in the past, it doesn't get you there as quickly as you would like, and sometimes it settles in an awkward space in the middle of semi-autocracy. But frankly, when you see what's going on in the streets of Tehran and Beijing, you take the semi rather than the full-on. Has anyone else got anything else they might like to add, critique? Or are you all thinking it's really time I went and got a coffee? I think that seems to be the only question. So I will simply thank you very much for your attention, because I know how hard it is over lunchtime. And if you'd like to grab a word on anything, I will be outside, and enjoy the rest of your day.